Welcome, everybody, to the Truthful Hope podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Vazquez. Is materialism true? And in other words, is the universe and everything in it just simply made up of matter and moved by mindless forces, meaning nothing immaterial or supernatural exists? Is that true? It seems that Western culture has adopted this ideology as the default view of reality. But is it true? I go back to that question. And what are the moral implications of this worldview? To address these two questions, I have joining me Barry Arrington, who's going to discuss all of this and unpack materialism from his new book, Unforgetting God. And I'll show it here. Barry, thank you so much for jumping on the show.
Jacob, thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah, well, I was just telling you before we started recording, this book has become one of my favorites. I've read, a good amount of apologetics books, Greg Kokel, Frank Turek, William Lane Craig, and they've all put out some really good popular level, that are quite dense apologetics books showing the truth of Christianity. But you do, I think, a phenomenal job. I want to say like right up there with the top of the top, because you communicate so many issues, so many arguments for God and Christianity in so many pages in an understandable way. So I'm really excited to just jump on and talk about this book with you for our listeners. And for our listeners, I do want to just give them your background because it is impressive. For you guys to understand who Barry is more. He's an attorney and a former member of the Colorado State House of Representatives. He earned his law degree from the University of Texas School of Law. He worked in civil litigation, nonprofit law, and constitutional law, particularly in the area of First and Second Amendment law. And he's represented victims of the Columbine school shooting, to litigating challenges to unconstitutional laws before the U.S. Supreme Court, and firsthand in these cases has seen how materialism has destroyed lives. And in Unforgetting God, the book that we'll be discussing today, he argues against materialism and instead for intelligent design, and specifically the existence of the God of the Bible. So, Barry, again, I want to thank you for jumping on. And we have a lot to discuss today.
Well, thank you, Jacob, and it's quite an honor that anybody would even suggest mentioning me with that list of luminaries that you talked about earlier. But those are the all stars, obviously. So thank you very, very much. That's high praise.
Yeah, well, there's some books where you start reading and you're like, oh, this might take a little bit of time. I'm going to put it down. I'll get back to it in a couple months or whatever. And this book, I told you before we started, I heard you speak about your book on an interview. I think it was with Dr. Casey Luskin on ID the Future. And that's what made me buy your book, because what you were saying was just the way you articulated it. I was just, this is awesome. It also made me want to reach out to you. And then I bought the book. I got it. We had scheduled the interview, and I'm like, I want to try and read. I'll just go through the book before we get on a call. And I picked it up, and I just couldn't put it down. So it's one of those books where it's like you're stuck in it. And anytime I come across that kind of book, it is worth recommending. So I told you before, I do recommend this book to non-believers, struggling Christians, because it is one of a kind. So really excited for today's conversation. And with that said, I do want to just jump right in, if that's okay with you.
Of course.
Before we were discussing, in email threads back and forth, that you recently had a case in the Supreme Court regarding the potential violation of the First Amendment for what, in my opinion, is injustice towards, a Christian peacefully and consistently living out their faith. Can you unpack this for us, within legal boundaries, of course? What was this case all about?
Sure. My client is a woman named Kaylee Childs. The case is Childs v. Salazar. Your listeners may have heard about it because it received quite a bit of media coverage. And so 3 years ago, last month, September of 2022, I filed this case on behalf of Kaylee. She came to me in the summer of 2022, and she said, look, I am a certified counselor in the state of Colorado, and Colorado has this law. And let's have a hypothetical. Say a 17-year-old young man walks into my office and he's struggling with transgender issues. He's struggling with same-sex attraction, and those things go against his religious views. And he says to me, "I need help. Please help me." And if Kaylee were to help him, she would lose her license and be fined $5,000. The only thing you can do under Colorado law is says, oh, those things are great, go for it, or be silent. You
Wow.
cannot help them become comfortable with their own body and their own sex, uh, natural sex between opposite sexes. If you do otherwise, you're risking severe penalties. And so we filed the case 3 years ago, and we took it all the way through the United States District Court. We lost, and then we took it into the 10th Circuit. At this point, an organization that your listeners may be familiar with, Alliance Defending Freedom. And by the way, Alliance Defending Freedom is an amazingly good organization. I've been working with them since 1994, back when they were called Alliance Defense Fund. But I cannot recommend enough. If you're looking for year-end giving or something to do with charitable contributions, think about ADF, because they really are kind of think of them as the Christian ACLU. When Christians' constitutional rights are being violated, they stand ready to help. And so when we got to the 10th Circuit, the Court of Appeals, I partnered with ADF, and they came on board, and then we took it together, and we lost in the 10th Circuit. Oh, so we've lost in the District Court. We lost in the 10th Circuit. Well, the next step is the United States Supreme Court. And so it's called petitioning for certiorari. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying, hey, will you take this case? And your listeners might not know, but hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of cases are petitioned to the Supreme Court every year. The Supreme Court actually only hears about 80 to 90 on the merit. The vast majority of them are turned away. So anytime you're taking a case up on cert, it's a flyer. The odds are stacked against you, but God was with us, and the Supreme Court granted our petition for certiorari, and we briefed the case, ADF right in the thick of it with the briefs, and then on October 7th, we appeared in the United States Supreme Court and argued the case. Of course, the state of Colorado's Solicitor General argued their side of the case, and now it stands submitted, as the judges say, and we hope to hear the result in the next couple of months.
Wow. 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 Well, if I could advise our listeners to do anything, it's to pray that case
Yes.
is won, because it's a dangerous place where, when we try and be consistent with our faith, especially in a loving way, to love our neighbor, and to not give in to something that could harm them. It's a very dangerous world that we begin to live in when that is forced upon, when you have to abide by that. So this is a major case for the world, really, for what we may come to.
So this is not a unique law. There are
Mm,
several of these laws around the country. And I think
wow.
force is the key word there. Colorado has taken a side in the culture war,
Mm,
and it forces compliance. And so one thing that is kind of central to the First Amendment, at least every lawyer's taught this in law school, is the state cannot pick an orthodoxy and impose it on the people. Which we're saying is that this is exactly what the state of Colorado has done. And the state of Colorado has a kind of a terrible track record in this regard in the Supreme Court. You might remember Jack Phillips and the Masterpiece Cake Shop, where the state was forcing him to create messages celebrating same-sex marriages in violation of his deeply held beliefs. You might remember 303 Creative, where the state was forcing a website designer to design for same-sex weddings in violation of her deeply held beliefs. Colorado lost both of those cases. Undeterred, they came right back at it with this one. And so we hope that this will form a troika of losses for
Wow.
the state of Colorado.
Wow. Yeah. Well, this is a big one. So, to all our, Christian listeners here, be deep in prayer. Pray that this case is won and that justice is served. So, and I'm just grateful that Barry, that God is using, folks like you who are not only faithful and willing, to handle these cases and represent believers, because that's necessary, but you're also knowledgeable in the Lord and in the things of Christianity. So you're equipped with these with this weaponry, so to speak. And I think, you know, this case that you're dealing with has a lot to do, in my mind, with what you wrote in your book about materialism and the end goal of, you know, the moral implications of this worldview. So it's a really good segue into my next question. I kind of, you know, briefly introduced this idea in the first introductory statements I made, but what is materialism, and how did you see the poor implications of it specifically play out during your time representing the victims of the horrific Columbine school shooting?
Okay, so materialism, you kind of got it in one in the introduction. It's a fairly simple concept that in the entire universe, there is nothing but particles in motion. That's it. There's no immaterial spirit, there's no immaterial mind. That everything is simply particles in motion. And in the book, I talk about, well, how does this work? Well, obviously, the standard model of cosmology posits the Big Bang. And so, which is kind of something from nothing. The entire universe exploded into existence in an instant at a point in space and time. And as Joe Rogan says, well, you give us this one miracle, we'll take it from there. But what happened after the Big Bang? Well, there's a vast expansion, and gravitational forces formed stars and galaxies and planets, and nothing happened but what was dictated by physical law acting upon particles through mindless forces. And through a very long, complex process that encompasses billions of years, on one of the planets in the universe, the Earth, living matter became non-living matters. Nobody really knows how. Anybody who tells you they know how non-living matter became living matter is lying to you, because nobody does. And then that's another miracle that they actually kind of tacitly ask for, because they can't explain it. And then after living matter became the process of evolution developed, until at some point, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years later, there arose on that planet a species of clever hairless apes. Now, what kind of intrinsic value do these clever hairless apes have? They call themselves humans, by the way. And the answer is that under materialism, they are nothing but the particles that make up their bodies. In other words, you're made of carbon and phosphorus, and you got sugars. And if all of those particles added together, that's what you're worth, because that's under materialism, that's all you are. Basically, it's a reductionist theory that materialism says that everything is every being is reducible to the particles that make it up. Well, that has tremendous implications for morality, because what is morality? Well, there are two choices. Morality is something that exists and it's transcendent. And we could talk about where the source of that transcendence is. Historically, it's been grounded in God's being, that it doesn't matter what people say. If you've got two people who disagree about a moral issue, well, the truth of the matter is independent of what either of them thinks. That's one view. The other view doesn't really exist, that morality is simply an evolutionary adaptation that those hairless apes have they help them in their survival business. And when you look at it that way, well, if morality really doesn't objectively exist in any sort of transcendent way, what does that what kind of implications does that have for law and politics and human relations? And this is where critical theory is very important, because critical theory, I'm going to surprise you. Critical theory is absolutely right, and it's inescapable. Its conclusions are inescapable if you accept their premises. Their premises, of course, are materialism. I say that critical theory is simply metaphysical materialism applied to human relations. And so what does that mean? Well, there's no real morality. All human dynamics, law, politics, family, anytime two humans are in the same vicinity of one another, uh, there's no real moral constraints. Everything is power dynamics. Those who have power, those who don't have power. And so I've seen this working out in the law. We could talk about that later. I've seen it working out in philosophy. It's the philosophy of Nietzsche. It's and I will take it on down. It's a long-winded answer to your question. To April 20th, 1999. Eric Harris was something of a thinker. He had studied evolution. He had studied philosophy. It surprised me when I read that too. He had studied philosophy. And one of his heroes was Nietzsche. And what did Nietzsche say? There is no God. Everything is just about power and dominating other people and acts of the will. And people say, well, what was the motive of Columbine? Well, we don't have to guess about that. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, in their various writings and videos and audio recordings, told us that they were exercising their will. They literally believed that they had evolved into a Nietzschean Übermensch. It didn't use the word Übermensch, but the concept of we have evolved beyond the common ken of humankind was pervasive in their writings and recordings. And they acted upon that and killed their classmates because they said, well, they're our classmates. We own no more obligations, moral obligations to our classmate that a lion owes to a gazelle.
It's really wild. When I saw there was one of the opening lines to your book, I think it was chapter 1 was Materialism 101, and you recounted that that individual, the one
Eric
who
Harris?
did the crime, yeah, Eric Harris, and the evidence that you showed of like what he said in those recordings and in the transcripts, it is so clear that he was indeed just all up into the materialistic ideology. And it's a clear implication of what this leads to. Because, like you mentioned, and we'll
Well,
get into,
let me stop you
yeah.
right there, Jacob. I understand where you're going with that. It led to this with Eric.
Mm,
My thesis in the book is that not all materialists are psychopathic killers. As a matter of
yeah.
fact, the overwhelming majority of materialists aren't psychopathic killers. But what are the overwhelming majority of materialists? They cannot say that Eric Harris was wrong. They cannot say that Eric Harris was evil because they deny any objective contents to those two words. They might say, well, I disagree with it strongly, but they can't say in any objective sense that what Eric Harris did was evil. And
Mm,
so no materialists, I say this in the book, no sane materialists can live consistently with their basic metaphysical premises.
mm. So good. And we'll touch on some of the arguments that you briefly mentioned, like the beginning of the universe, morality, and consciousness. I definitely want to touch on those with you. But before we do that, I've read, a lot of apologetic books, like I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of general apologetics books with all these arguments, but your book was unique in that you had a chapter titled, Where Do Rights Come From? Especially given your legal background. And this hit home for me because one of my lanes of focus, so to speak, is abortion, the issue of abortion. And I constantly hear and, read pro-choicers, you've seen it too, chant, my body, my choice. It's my right to choose. It's implying or assuming the existence of rights. But the question is, where do these rights come from? So, do you mind just unpacking what you have in that chapter? Where do rights come from, and how does that relate to materialism?
Okay. So that's a very good question. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. There really are two and only two choices. Either materialism is correct, and through processes we haven't really even begun to grasp, life form from non-life, and this physical thing arose until ultimately a species of clever hairless apes who call themselves humans started walking the planet. That's one theory.
Mm,
The competing theory is humans are made in the image of God, Imago Dei. That's it. Those are the two choices that you have, clever hairless ape or Imago Dei. And those have really serious implications for the theory of rights. Let's say that you are the clever hairless ape camp. And I'm going to rely heavily upon a very famous, very influential judge. He was the chief judge for the Seventh Circuit of the United States Court of Appeals in Chicago until very recently, kind of a poster boy for the intellectual elite in the law in the last 50 years. And he wrote this article, and he talked about how there cannot be any serious moral grounding if materialism is true, and he is a materialist, he is an atheist, and he says that the Holocaust, while he didn't agree with it, he would have stopped it if he could, was not objectively evil. That when at the Nuremberg trials, those people were punished not because what they did was objectively immoral. It's because we won the war and were able to punish them, and we had the power to do so. And that he agreed with that. But the best we can say, this is Richard Posner, and I quote him in the book, that we can say the Holocaust was evil by our lights as Americans in the 21st century. But all morality is what he called localized, and we can't say that the Third Reich's morality is superior to us. In other words, the Holocaust is not Richard Posner's cup of tea, but he's not going to be a judge of anyone else's tea preferences, right? That's one view. The other view is no Imago Dei, that there is a God. And that God, and this is the view expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that God endowed people, his image bearers, with certain inalienable rights. And one of those rights is the right to life. And it does not matter what any particular government says at any particular time. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letters from the Birmingham jail quoted this very eloquently, where he said, "Jim Crow laws are no laws because a unjust law is no law." And he quoted Aquinas and Augustine for this particular thing. And as it applies to the Third Reich, I tell people, and this surprises a lot of people, Holocaust was not illegal. It was not illegal in the sense that it did not violate any of the internal laws of Germany at the time. How do we know this? Well, because the government of Germany sanctioned it, and therefore is by definition not illegal. But that law sanctioning the Holocaust was, in Martin Luther King's word, no law, because it was an unjust law, because it violated the basic laws given by the lawgiver. And he endowed each of those 6 million Jews that were killed with that indelible, indefeasible right to life. And while I'm talking about this, I'm going to go off script. The right has got to police itself. This anti-Semitism that has crept into the right has got to stop. The Jews have been persecuted for 3,000 years. And in my view, the Jews are the canary in the cultural coal mine. And if you see a culture that's starting to persecute the Jews, and I see it far along in the left, I see it incipient in the right, that culture is in serious trouble. I call upon every Christian to stamp out this stain of anti-Semitism wherever they find it, and to argue against it wherever they hear it. I'm sorry about going off script there.
No, no, you're good. That's 100%. I mean, I don't even know if you knew this, but I'm Jewish, and
Oh,
I don't know
well,
how you
I
would,
did not know
but
that.
yeah, I am,
Vazquez
and
does not seem like a Jewish name.
yeah, no, no, definitely Puerto Rican, but my
Yeah,
mom's Jewish, and I actually just recently had Jeff Morgan. I don't know if you're familiar with Jews for Jesus. Do you know their
I am,
ministry?
sure.
So I had him on. He's like he's always on the streets of Israel, talking to Jews about Jesus, and he brought up a good point. He's like, Jesus is Jewish, and the disciples are Jewish, and it's. I always say, people, the most Jewish thing you can do is believe in the Jewish Messiah. So we have to remember our roots, both non-believing Jew and Christian alike. We have to remember that it starts in Israel. So when we talk about anything anti-Semite, it's not okay. It's not allowed, and it's just we should be in repentance on that for sure. So I appreciate
And
you
we
bringing
should,
that up.
yeah. Thank you. And so back on script, that the Holocaust was a violation of what was called the natural law. That's the
Mm.
law that's set forth in the Declaration of Independence. And so I quote in the book this political reporter who says, well, Christian nationalists are these nutcases that believe that God established our rights instead of the Supreme Court of the Congress. Well, for obvious reasons that we just went over, I don't think she really thought that one through.
I have a question on that. This is also off script. What do you make of Christian nationalism? Because that term has always confused me. In that, if you mean it in the sense of a theocracy, I don't think any Christians, or I don't want to say any, but I don't think most Christians are looking to start a theocracy. But if you mean it in the sense of having your faith influence how you vote, I think Christians ought to do that, or you're living inconsistent with your faith. So, what do you make of Christian nationalism?
The first thing I make about Christian nationalism, I would never call myself a Christian nationalist. For the same
Mm,
reason, I wouldn't call myself a fundamentalist. Why? Well, fundamentalism means that I believe the Bible and that it's inerrant and that there are a lot of things that fundamentalists believe that I believe. I don't agree with everything they say, but the very moment that I call myself fundamentalist, what the culture here hears is Barry just called himself stupid, bigoted, and ignorant,
mm,
and because that's what the term has come to mean in the culture. The left has worked very hard to do the same sort of work on Christian nationalism. I would never call myself a Christian nationalist because the left has established in the minds of the people, the culture, that anyone who says they're a Christian nationalist is working towards overturning freedom of religion and freedom of conscience and imposing a theocracy on the United States. And so I think it's a label that is not useful. For the same reason that fundamentalist is not useful. And so, uh, how should Christians approach politics? Well, the same way they approach everything, that we are the salt, we are the light, and that we bring the transcendent moral values that are reflected in the Bible and the Spirit of God that is reflected in Jesus Christ into the public square, and we engage. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but we get to talk. And if we
mm.
persuade our fellow citizens that we're right, then that should become the law.
Right. Absolutely. That's
Through the
very well
democratic
said.
processes, by the way. Not we don't.
Mm,
It's a matter of persuasion. It's a matter of engagement. It's not a matter of force. The party of force right now is the progressive party. You scratch a progressive, you'll find someone who wants to force you to do their bidding underneath. Which is back to where we started. The progressives passed that law that's been wildly inconsistent with the First Amendment, saying that a counselor cannot help a man who comes into her office struggling with an issue. And you can't tell me that's not force.
mm. It's interesting because the progressives will typically say you can't force your morality on other people, but you're inevitably going to force your morality through law. It's not about whether or not you force morality; it's about which morality. Right at the end of the day, and here we have a case where you're forcing immorality on Christians, and it's a very tough place to be in. So, like you said, it does go full circle all the way back to how we started with that case that's still in progress. Wow.
Martin Luther King again. I can't force my morality on another man, but I can keep him from hanging me, right? And
Mm,
so uh, the absurdity of law cannot um, embody a moral view is that it's just exactly the opposite of the truth.
mm,
Law always embodies a moral view on every issue that impacts the great moral issues. I'm not saying that every issue in the law drive 55 or 70. That probably doesn't invoke any moral view. But every law that impinges upon the great moral issues must embody a moral view. The left is corrupted by John Rawls, who said that there's this view from nowhere, just this morally neutral view from nowhere, and that's all we're asking for. Well, nonsense. There is no such thing. Every view is always going to be influenced by your conception of God. This is Tocqueville said this. Every action, he said, not just every moral action, every action of a man is in some fashion shaped by his views of whether the creator, and if there is a creator, that creator's nature.
mm. So, wow, that's really well said. And I think, to sum up that the way you answered that question of where do rights come from, your whole point is you need a grounding place for rights, or it's just thrown in the air, and might makes right. And, whoever gets to decide will eventually decide. If you're a Jew during the Holocaust, you don't have rights. If you're the unborn today, you don't have rights. And it's just because someone arbitrarily decided that you don't have them. But if God does exist and that Christianity is true, then everybody has the right to life, and you can't strip that away. There's nothing you can do to outperform or underperform the deserving of the right to life. So it has serious implications when you just look at recent history and our current times today. Now, you going back to materialism. Now, you have a chapter titled, I believe it's titled, "The Case for Christianity." And this was a long chapter, but you go through a lot of the arguments that I think every Christian should memorize. The cosmological, the fine tuning, the moral, from consciousness. So I want to ask you about some of these. We did talk about the moral argument already, so I want to stick here for a little bit. And just for context for our listeners, these arguments that we're displaying are not proof or not evidence of Christianity per se. It's more of a theism, a theistic God. But I do want to shift our conversation afterwards to what makes Christianity true. So just giving you a layout of where we're going. So for now, let's stick with the moral argument. You already, spoke about it already, and I'll just restate it how William Lane Craig restated it. Stated it. It's if objective morality does not exist, God does not. God does not exist. Objective morality does exist, therefore God exists. Very straightforward, plainly stated. So my question to you is, given what we've already talked about, the moral argument, what would you say to someone who says, "Okay, but materialists could be good people too"?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. And one of the things I've already said, yes, the overwhelming majority of materialists are fine people. I've known a lot of them, and they're relatively good people. I'm not saying that every materialist is going to be a psychopathic killer like Eric Harris was. Eric Harris just lived out his materialism freely. But what every materialist can't say is that there's an objective reason why they shouldn't go out and do whatever they want to, because they're under their view, every other person is just an amalgamation of particles. No more inherent dignity than a rock. People say, well, that's not can't possibly. Yes, it is true. If you take materialism seriously, we're just amalgamated particles, just like a rock is amalgamated particles. And yes, we have chemistry that gives us animation. We don't understand how that began and how the evolution. We have a kind of grand meta narrative of evolution, but the details are forever going further and further back into uh, the, uh, they're just, the details are receding, I should
Mm.
say, as science advances. Science is beginning to prove, in other words, science is beginning to prove that evolution, at least as the Darwinian conception of unguided evolution, is becoming less and less plausible the more and more that we know. And so that's the choice that you have to make. Either, yes, the Holocaust was objectively evil, or you can have your materialism. You can't have both.
Mm. And that's very well put. And what someone may say, and I've heard this so many times, is, oh, well, objective morality can just come about from evolution or society. Now, how would you respond to those? I'll give my input as well, but how would you respond to those objections?
So, the easy way to respond to those is it's almost absurd that someone would say that. You had two societies in 1943.
Mm.
You had Western liberal democracy that respected the God-given right to life as reflected in the Declaration of Independence. And you had the Third Reich. The societies were independent of one another. One said it's okay to kill 6 million Jews. Others said it's not. Which of them is correct? Because under your view, if society creates rights and creates morality, by definition, what they were doing in Germany was right. And if Germany had won the world, the Holocaust would have been deemed to be not just not evil, but an affirmative good.
Mm.
That a philosophy that leads to that conclusion is absurd.
Right. It's funny too, because it's ironic, I should say. The war in Gaza that's been going on has created a lot of stir on social media between the left standing up for Gaza and the right, typically standing up for Israel, right? And a lot of people on the left saying that the Palestinians have experiencing injustice and free Palestine and all this stuff. This outcry of injustice is showing that they believe in objective morality. Because if they truly believed in their subjective morality, that, oh, there is no real right or wrong, then you would have to say, well, there's nothing wrong with with what Israel's doing. But if you say that, they'll say, oh no, what they're doing is absolutely wrong. So if we agree on that, then the next question we have to ask is, where are we grounding this standard from? Where are we deciding why somebody is wrong? And when someone says society, I like to bring back to what's called the reformer dilemma, where
There
it's
you go.
with this
Yes. Jim
right
Crow
with this.
South, Martin Luther
Yeah,
King.
there you go. Go ahead. I'll
You
let
do
you
it?
explain it.
No. You go ahead. I love it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, because the reforma dilemma, they were actively treating African Americans as lesser than, and it took a small group of mostly Christian abolitionists to go and fight against the legality of slavery. Now, surely nobody today would say that those reformers were immoral, but if we're going on the definition that morality is set by society, they would be immoral for going against the societal standard. So I think it falls just on its face when you think a little deeply about it. So, like you said, I
And
just
that's
think,
why really honest materialists admit this. Richard
yeah,
Posner was first in his class at, I think, Yale undergrad, first in his class, Harvard Law School. Smart guy.
mm,
And one of the most influential, perhaps the most influential judge in the last 50 years. And he fesses up. Look, there's there is no objective morality, and
mm,
all his famous phrase, all morality is local. And so in the 1950s, he would say, it depends on where you draw the local lines. If you draw them south of the Mason-Dixon line, then Jim Crow was perfectly moral, because that's what the people in the South wanted at the time. That was the societal norm. But if you draw it perhaps at a higher level of generality, the United States, well, then you could make a case for imposing Brown versus Board, for example, on the whole nation. But you can't say that that what the people in the South were doing was objectively wrong in any transcendent sense because you, by definition, as a materialist, deny the existence of such.
Mm, so good. Now, shifting out to the beginning of the universe, you brought this up in the beginning. Do you want to just rehash what this argument is and then why materialism just really can't explain the beginning of the universe?
So the standard model of cosmology now, and this deserves a caveat. If the standard model is a scientific theory, and all scientific theories are tentative,
Mm,
Popper says, and I agree with that. And maybe another theory will come along and knock the standard model off. Well, if that is the case, is my belief in God going to just fall with it? And the answer is no. I'm saying that the standard model supports a theistic view, but same as a dozen other arguments also support a theistic view. The theistic view was overwhelmingly supported before the Big Bang Theory, and still supported with the Big Bang Theory, and it will continue to be overwhelmingly supported if the Big Bang Theory is supplanted. So don't put all your theological eggs in a scientific basket is what I'm trying to say. But right
mm.
now, we live in a time where science is telling you, God did it. Look what happened. And if we're going to say that, we'll take it, right? And because the Big Bang says at a particular moment in time, the universe leapt into existence, and the law of sufficient reason says there had to be a cause for that. Well, what are the options? Well, the universe can't be its own cause because self-causation is logically incoherent. It can't be caused from nothing. For getting something from nothing is logically incoherent. And therefore, the third option is something beyond it that is not subsumed by it caused it. And we call that God. And here we have the column argument that which begins to exist is caused. The universe began to exist. The universe had a cause. The logic can't be refuted.
Mm.
Now
So good. And
you can argue with the premises, but the deduction can't be refuted.
right. And I love how Dr. Frank Turek put it. You know, the Big Bang model, standard Big Bang model that you mentioned, is that time, space, and matter came to being together all simultaneously. Now, for
So
that to happen,
instead of saying what happened before the Big Bang is a meaningless question because there was
yeah,
no time until the Big Bang.
right. So the cause of the universe must be timeless and spaceless and immaterial and then personal in order to choose to create, because that's a free will decision. That's something that a person would have to choose to do. And you really seem to play out the identification of God, of the
Yeah.
God of Genesis 1:1. So it's a really good argument. Like I said, you know, like you said, you don't have to put all your eggs in that basket. But surely the scientific evidence does show, hey, this is lining up with what we see in Genesis. So
So
that's
so this is just a species of cosmological argument. The ontological argument. There are other arguments. The argument from necessity, and this is an ancient argument. It goes back to Aristotle that everything that we see around us is contingent. It didn't cause itself. It didn't create itself. It didn't come into being. And there's a chain of contingent causes all the way back, and that chain has to have a start, and that start is not contingent but necessary. So the necessary being that's the ground of being for all contingent beings is God.
right. So for our listeners, again, the premise is whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. What is that cause? A timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal cause. Otherwise, God. So, like, really clear argument. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I do have other questions to get to for you. But some might say, who created God? And you spend a nice section addressing that objection. To me, it's fairly simple. It's a categorical error. And it doesn't even go with our premises, which is whatever begins to exist. And
Right.
God does and never began. I don't believe that God began to exist. The atheist doesn't believe that God began to exist. So I asked them, what are we even talking about? We don't believe in that. So it's just, if you want more information to our listeners, again, It's a good segue to give you a little shameless plug again. Purchased Unforgettable God. It is worth the read. Now, I want to jump to Christianity, because what we just talked about was you could narrow down this evidence to a theistic God, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, but which one is true, right? That's the question. We don't have too much time left, so I'm not going to have you, go through a whole lecture on this, but what are some reasons that you believe that Christianity is true?
And I think that is the appropriate way to pose the issue, Jacob, is that reasons to believe. And because Christianity is a historical religion, it utterly depends upon the veracity of certain truth claims, that certain events occurred at certain times in history. And if they didn't occur, Christianity is false. C.S. Lewis said it best. He said, Christianity is a claim about the world that if it's true, it's the most important thing in the entire universe. If it's false, you can just ignore it. What it can't be is moderately important. And so what we have to do, what every person must do, and that's the purpose of the book, is to present the evidence, evaluate the evidence, and find out which way that evidence preponderates. The evidence preponderates overwhelmingly that there is a God. I mean, atheism and materialism is really incoherent at the end of the day. Not only is false, it's incoherent. That not only is theism true, but the overwhelming historical evidence of the resurrection is also true. There's not only good reason, there's compelling reason to believe the claims of Jesus Christ and fall at his feet and worship him as Savior. And resurrection really is the key. And that's my book focuses exclusively on the evidences for the resurrection. And there's men have written 1,000-page books on the evidence for the resurrection. Needless to say, there's a lot of it. And
on row two, right there. Those three books in the white. That's Gary Habermas's. Those are big books.
Those are big books. And just so your readers know, most of my arguments, actually all of my arguments for the apologetics, are sketches of the arguments, and I point people to resources if they want to jump into them deeper, because you can spend a lifetime exploring these arguments, and people have. And then the bottom line is this: you've got the evidence, and in the law, every one of us is called what's called a fact finder. What's a fact finder? So if I try a case, if I bring my case, my client and I sit in the courtroom, I bring in witnesses, I bring in documents, and then I make my arguments. And the fact finder, if it's tried to the judge finds the facts. These are the disputed facts. Are these are the facts that I actually believe. If it's tried to a jury, the jury is the fact finder, and they say, "Well, you're right, you're wrong. I believe your evidence. I don't believe your evidence." And in other words, it's proved. And so we are the fact finder. We are the fact finder. We evaluate the evidence and determine whether the claims of Christianity have been proved. And we don't have time, obviously, to go into all of those claims and all the evidence, but any reasonable observer, in my view, would have to conclude that they've been proved. And not just proved. Proof is a spectrum. It's not a if, yes, no. There's preponderate, what lawyers say is probably true, more probable than not. There's clear and convincing evidence, good, strong proof. And there's the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the criminal burden of proof, where there's no real reason to doubt the truth of the claims. In my view, and I think it's been overwhelmingly demonstrated, the veracity of the resurrection and the claims of Jesus Christ are true beyond a reasonable doubt. And that requires us to respond to those claims. And the way we respond to those claims is to accept Jesus as our personal Savior. And not only it operates at two levels. It operates obviously at a personal level, where every individual who comes into communion with Christ is assured eternal life. It also operates at a societal level where we do not descend into paganism, where the culture believes that materialism and disbelieves imago Dei. John Daniel Davidson wrote a fabulous book recently called Pagan America, where he talks about the cultural consequences of the retreat from this idea of imago Dei in our time, and where that's heading if we don't arrest it.
Hmm. So good. And, again, to our listeners, I'm going to point you back to Unforgetting God, because Barry goes through all the evidence that he's pointing to for the resurrection, for God's existence. It's all in this book, and it's easy to understand. I can't emphasize that enough. It's those books up there, phenomenal work. Does take a little bit of reading and a lot of sifting through. This book you could get it, and
So
you could rehash
that's
it to
one of the
others.
things I think as a lawyer. Um, uh, Jerry Spence was a famous trial lawyer, and I actually attended a conference that he did once, and he said something that I will never forget. If you're going to go in front of a jury and you can't explain why you should win in one sentence, you deserve to lose.
Mm,
And so, as a lawyer, what you're doing is marshaling the facts, condensing the facts, summarizing the facts, and presenting that in an understandable way. So that's one of the a good trial lawyer it will make things easy to understand for the jury. Because if you confuse the jury, you're losing.
yeah. No, that's really good. And you not only did you present the evidence, like you didn't just stop there, you also handled objections, and you went into depth, a lot of depth in these objections, because there's a lot of them, right? And you did a phenomenal job, I think, of handling them. But two that stood out to me, you pretty much just addressed, in that you can't prove God exists, and there's no evidence to support that. Now, you just addressed that, and I'm happy you did. But I was just writing some thoughts I had, and one thought I had was evidence without curiosity is meaningless. And the reason I said that is because, I see, like like we both see some of the like brightest minds, Stephen C. Meyer, James Torr, William Dembski, Michael Behe, come up with really sophisticated scientific evidence for a designer. That's almost undisputable. But still, Darwinian evolutionists will, oh no, it's not real science. Oh no, it can't be a designer. It could be anything else but God. So there's no curiosity to see, is there really a designer? It's just they're waving it off to begin with. So I think when we talk about evidence and proof, there has to be some curiosity. And my worry is that a lot of people, especially in today's world, are becoming more apathetic towards the question of God. So when you said that C.S. Lewis quote, that means a lot. And I think our listeners should remember that when dealing out with the culture, because the existence of God is much more important than like your favorite ice cream flavor.
Yeah.
It has serious implications that need to be ironed out.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that? Any comments on evidence is without curiosity is meaningless?
So I once was on the internet and I came across a website called The Skeptical Zone, and it was run by a bunch of materialists, and they claimed to be skeptical of everything. Well, I kind of wandered through it for a while, and turns out they were skeptical of the claims of Christianity. They were skeptical of theism. They were skeptical of miracles. They were skeptical of anything that even remotely traditional Western values and concepts. You know what they weren't skeptical about? What they showed the least little tiny little bit of curiosity about? Their own views, their own shibboleths, as it were. And so I thought to myself, they should rename this the skeptical zone, except we're not skeptical about anything that's taken for granted in the cultural elite. And they probably really did think of themselves as skeptics, but they were far the furthest thing from skeptics that you could possibly be. And one of the things I do in the book is I call on people to be skeptical. Skeptical of what? Skeptical of the claims that are predominantly, overwhelmingly impacting the intellectual elite in Western culture. The intelligentsia swims in these materialist claims and mindset. Well, those people haven't really thought those claims through, as that Politico reporter indicated. She said, "Well, only stupid people believe that rights come from anything but government." Well, really? Are the founders stupid? Did you really think that through? No, that's what she was taught in her materialist school, and she never really thought to challenge it. I'm saying we should become skeptics of those claims as well as religious claims. Let the evidence speak one way or the other and see who's proved their case. Now, you can't prove one thing that you can't prove Christianity beyond. You can prove it, in my view, beyond a reasonable doubt. Can you prove it to where there is zero doubt? Apodoptic proof, like the proof like 2 plus 2 is 4. That's obviously true in an apodictic sense, a deductive sense. And the answer to that is no, you can't. There's always going to be room for doubt. But that shouldn't bother us, because the scripture told us that would happen. Where did it tell us that? It says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. For those who come to God must believe that he is, and that he is rewarder of them that diligently seek him. Well, what is faith? What do you have faith against? You have faith against doubt. And I absolutely love uh, this quote from, in my view, one of the greatest authors of all time, Dostoevsky.
Mm.
And he was a thorough Christian worldview, but he struggled. He really struggled. He suffered a lot in his time in the mid 19th century in Russia. He had to deal with a lot of pain and horrible things. And he said towards the end of his life, he says, "It is not as a child that I believe and confess Jesus Christ. My Hosanna was born in a furnace of doubt."
Mm.
If your Hosanna goes through the furnace and you're still a believer on the other side, you're a strong believer. And that's what I call people to do. Engage those doubts. See if they can be addressed. Can they be addressed to where there's zero evidence, zero room to doubt the claims of theism, the claims of Christ? No, can't be. Is the overwhelmingly best answer God exists and so does Jesus, and the resurrection occurred? Yes,
Absolutely. And it matters, right? Like
it matters.
this issue matters. And you pointed that out in your book. You make it clear all throughout that it's not just like a philosophical debate we're having or like a fun exercise of exchanging ideas. This is real. And especially in your line of work, you're seeing how real it is firsthand. Like, okay, materialism at one point started off as an idea, but here we are. People are telling Christians that you have to do what we say or else. You have to go against your beliefs or else, in Colorado and elsewhere. And it's shown even worse with the Holocaust and the Columbine shooting. It is literally becoming a matter, if not already has become a matter of life or death. So when that woman, that politician that you mentioned, said rights come from the government, well, if that's true, then rights are given and can be taken away. And that's a serious problem, as we're seeing with the unborn. So part of why I loved your book so much is because it wasn't just a analysis of ideas, but it was grounding. And you use your experience in the legal field as like a, let me show you why this is a big deal. Like, let me show you why this is not just a fun thing to do when you're home and you're tired and you want a book to read. This is real, like real stuff. So I really appreciate what you did here. And again, I think this is the third time, and I'm going to do it another time. For our listeners, go grab a copy, Unforgetting God. Barry, we are at the hour. Do you want to just share where can our listeners find more of your work, more of what you're doing? I know you're a busy guy. You got these cases to go through, but where can our listeners find more about you?
So I have a website, barryarrington.com. I also have a Substack and an X account. You can buy Unforgetting God on Amazon. And I'll just close with this. You're absolutely right. Pascal said it best, that everything depends upon getting this question right. Literally
Mm,
everything depends on getting this question right.
mm. Amen. Well, Barry, thank you so much for jumping on. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I am going to crush through the remaining few pages I have because I was like 98% done. I didn't meet my goal, but it's okay. Well, thank you again, Barry. I appreciate you joining. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. God bless.
Thank you. Take care.